the next one.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dermot. I was really feeling very energetic and young until I heard Mary talking about Generation Y. I want to start with Mark Twain, because we're going to talk about leadership and values. Sometimes I wonder whether the world is being run by smart people who are putting us on, or by imbeciles who really mean it. And maybe to kind of bring that a little bit more alive for you, I just give you an example of the kind of person that we mean here. So what I'm going to take a fairly philosophical perspective on this. I'm not going to talk about leadership in healthcare. I'm going to talk about leadership in terms of where we're at the current stage in modern society, and what actually seems to be happening, and how I think things are possibly going badly wrong with modern society. Now, the importance of values for leaders is that even leaders who appear on the face of it to be doing pretty well, if the values don't chime with that, they can very quickly get into trouble and start to damage their reputation. And that's a slightly lighter side of that, but if you really want a perspective at the moment on this importance of leadership and values, and the values of leaders, we don't have to look very far. We don't have to look very far to see where this becomes really, really serious. And what got me thinking about this, I think Dermot got thinking about it at the same time. A couple of years ago, we were teaching in Rwanda. And as you know, in Rwanda in 1994, 800,000 people were massacred in 90 days by the Interahamwe, the youth militias. And if you go to Kigali, there's a genocide museum there, and that's just one of the photographs I took in there. And one of the amazing things about that got us thinking about this was that these guys were led. They were incredibly effectively led. This was planned for about 2 years. They were told who they were going to massacre. They were trained and they were led. So the leadership in terms of efficacy, in terms of output and so on, was incredibly effective. Morally, or in terms of the values that underpinned it, it was completely bankrupt. And we were leaving, Dermot and I were actually leaving that centre, and we had missed this room, which was the children's room. And one of the guides said, "Have you seen the children's room yet?" And these were pictures that were sent to the centre by people who had lost their children. So all these children are dead. All these children are massacred. So this issue of leadership and the values that underpin leadership is an extremely important one. And it's one that I think bears a lot of thought and bears a great deal of consideration. Now, things may not be actually going so well if you start to look around. This is a very famous Irish poet and theologian, John O'Donoghue, who unfortunately died recently at a very young age. He was only 52. And John has become very well known internationally. But here's something that John said a few years ago, just thinking about current society. He said, "These times are riven with anxiety and uncertainty. In the hearts of people, some natural ease has been broken. Our trust in the future has lost its innocence. We know that anything can happen. The traditional structures of shelter are shaking, their foundations revealed to be no longer stone but sand." And if you take the pulse of the time, that's probably true of what a lot of people think, that something is changing, and what may emerge from that may not in fact be a very positive kind of society. The former Czech president and playwright Václav Havel said this. He said, "The tragedy of modern man is not that he knows less and less about the meaning of his own life, but that it bothers him less and less." And Havel went on to say this. He said, "I think there are good reasons for suggesting that the modern age has ended. Today, many things indicate that we're going through a transitional period when it seems that something is on the way out and something else is painfully being born. It's as if something were crumbling, decaying, and exhausting itself, while something else still indistinct were rising from the rubble." It's a pretty bleak view of current society, and a pretty bleak view of what might be the future, although I think there are possible antidotes, and I'll say something about that. And Havel finally said, modern man must descend the spiral of his own absurdity to the lowest point, and only then can he look beyond it. It's obviously impossible to get around it, jump over it, or simply avoid it. So there are quite a number of people who are standing back and looking at the kind of society and the kind of community that's been created. Look at financial services meltdown in the last few years. Look at the state of many people in Ireland, for example, living in poverty and negative equity, lack of certainty, increased anxiety. You look at places, some of the places we work, where political instability is becoming the norm. So if you think about this in a business context, then, this is a very interesting contribution from Klaus Schwab, who's the president of the Davos World Forum in 2004. He said, in today's trust-starved climate, our market-driven system is under attack. Large parts of the population believe that business has become detached from society, that business interests are no longer aligned with societal interests. The only way to respond to this anti-business sentiment is for business to take the lead and reposition it clearly and convincingly as part of society, not something that preys on society. This is one of my very favorite philosophers, Otto Scharmer, who's working in IT, and I think Scharmer has some really interesting stuff to say. So if we say, if that's the situation and it's as bad as that, are there ways of actually doing something about that, of changing that, or of making it better? Scharmer says, regardless of the culture or sector we come from, we all share one characteristic, and that is we participate in large systems in which we collectively create results that nobody wants. Now think about a lot of healthcare systems, think a lot about financial systems, think about the defense industry, the international defense industry. We consume the equivalent of 1.5 planets to meet our current needs. 2.5 billion people live in poverty, and 3 times as many people die by suicide as through wars or murder. So if we're moving into a postmodernist, if we're in a postmodernist kind of world, it could be pretty grim. So the question then arises is, how do you start to engage with that, and how do you start to look at ways in which people charged with leadership, whether that's people at the top of organizations or people throughout leadership throughout the organization, can actually look at that? Well, I think one of the most interesting things that Scharmer has to say is this. He says, our major error is that we try to learn exclusively from the past that's finished, rather than from the future as it emerges. So one of the things that Scharmer is saying is this, that very often when we're looking for solutions to problems, we look to the past, and we try to repeat what we did in the past, whether it was successful or not. The problem with that is that the system has actually shifted into a different state. And a better way of thinking about this from a leadership perspective is to actually start to look to a future that's already emerging and try to actually lead for that future that's starting to emerge. And that puts a very different kind of metric, and perhaps a more positive kind of look on this. So that brings me then to this idea of values-based leadership. And I just want to make a few points about this. That values are basically the guiding principles for individuals and organizations. That's what our values are. When they're declared and followed, they become the basis of trust, of motivation, and of commitment. There's some very good research emerging that businesses that take their values seriously outperform their competitors. So this isn't some kind of soft, wishy-washy kind of philosophy. That alignment of values and behavior, and John talked earlier about behavioral integrity, about the alignment of behavior with the culture of the organization, that alignment of values and behavior operates exponentially, not arithmetically. You don't get half or 0. You get, if the two things work together, 2 plus 2 can equal 7 or 8 or 9. And when we think about strategy, strategy is largely concerned with mission and vision, but values are the foundation, or should be the foundation of strategy, in my view. Now, when we're working with people, both on our master's programs, on our professional development programs, our short programs, and so on, very commonly professionals express in many different ways this sort of concern. I don't think I've got a pointer here, have I? If you look to the top left there, organizations will have a set of expressed values, and they will have a set of lived values. I'm showing that on the bottom right. And very often there's a gap between those, between what an organization says it does and what it actually does. And I think professionals see that gap very clearly, and it can be very frustrating to work with that gap because they end up what I call satisficing, doing well enough. But the same is true for us as individuals. So we have expressed values and we have lived values, and the question is, what's the gap between those two? From a leadership perspective, it seems to me probably the most important issue is what's the gap for people between their own lived values and the organization's lived values. And I think a very subtle form of professional stress, particularly in healthcare at the moment, is this gap between the personal values of very dedicated young doctors and nurses who want to do their best, who came into this as a service to provide service, a vocational dimension to it, and they are caught in a system which simply doesn't have the resources or the structures or the values to allow them to express that. And that's blaming people within the system doesn't get us very far. What we've actually got to do is look at the system itself and look at what the variables are within the system that can be changed. McGregor Burns, who most people here will have heard of before, anyone who's interested in management will know of him, he said, leaders embrace values, but values grip leaders. The stronger the value systems, the more strongly leaders can be empowered and the more they can empower followers. I think it was very interesting just listening to Mary talking about the generation wires. This is important. The meaning is important. What's this about? Why are we doing this? What are the values of the organization? William O'Brien is the former CEO of one of the biggest insurance companies in the United States. Said the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. That's a very interesting statement if you unpack it. The success of the intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. What's the value system of the person who's actually intervening? And if we go back to what's happening in Syria at the moment, that's the kind of question that raises for me. And it's not all bad news. I mean, there's a very interesting movement in the US and in various other parts of the world towards philanthropy. This is Chuck Feeney, who's very close Irish connections, close to education here in Ireland, has given most of his fortune away at this stage, and Berkshire Hathaway and Gates and so on, they're giving it away. They want to give it all away before they die. So there are sort of very positive things on the highway. Now this is what they call a very busy slide, and I'm not going to go through it, but the reason I put it up here is it's my favorite example of strategy, of a strategy document on a single page, and it's from the University of Leeds. And what Leeds did, they spent a great deal of time on this, so much so that they now travel the world showing other organizations in the education sector how to do this. And if you look at the top there on the left-hand side, they have their vision, their purpose, which is their mission, their stakeholders, their key strategy themes, their strategic enablers. But look at the foundation. The foundation for their whole strategy, and this was deliberate, was based on their values. They surfaced their values and then they decided they would build everything from there up. So I think what that means is that there are ways in which organizations can operationalize things in a sense that floats the values or identifies the values and actually builds on the values. And that to me is very important. This is a report that the Hay Group in the UK did just last year, where they looked at the leadership challenges for 2030. It's a very, very interesting report. And they identified what they call 6 megatrends that are happening worldwide that will change the face of organizations, change the face of business. The global balance of power is shifting east. Climate change in all kinds of complex ways will become a really important problem. The war for talent rages on, that this is something that, this is where competition is going to be fiercest, particularly in knowledge economies. That accommodating to growing individualism, and it'd be interesting to hear about, what are the next group, the Zs, is it? The Z, yeah. Be interesting to hear about more about that. Embracing the digital natives is going to become extremely important, and they're different. And then finally, harnessing technology to innovate. These are 6 megatrends. So they asked the question then, if that's the case, what kind of leaders are we going to need by the time we get to 2030? And here's their summary of this. That the leaders of the future will need to be adept conceptual and strategic thinkers, have deep integrity and intellectual openness, find new ways to create loyalty, lead increasingly diverse and independent teams over which they may not always have direct authority, relinquish their own power in favour of collaborative approaches inside and outside the organisation. That's an interesting summary. But right in the heart of that, it's interesting to see the term integrity, which again is based on values. Okay, finally, the touchstone for me for all of this kind of thinking, and we keep on and on and on coming back to it, or I do, is this book, and I'd recommend it to you. Many of you will have read it and will recognize it. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. As Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camp, Auschwitz, wrote this book soon after he was released. And he said that what he noticed in the concentration camps is that the people that survived are those who were able to create some sense of meaning out of what was happening to them. And his kind of core idea was that if there's anything that characterizes human beings, it is that we are essentially meaning-creating creatures. That's what we're about, creating meaning. And it seems to me that what's very important for organizations in that context is that a value system must exist within an organization that actually allows for the creation of meaning. And my final slide, if I just broaden that out to take in a broader perspective, a universal perspective, this is my favorite quote from Albert Einstein. He said, "A human being is a part of the whole called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself or herself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for the few persons nearest to us. An illusion. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Nobody is able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such achievement is in itself a part of the liberation and a foundation for inner security. It's not necessarily the end point that's important, it's the journey to getting there." Thank you very much.